Welcome to Thought Hack.
I art's important. I love music. I love infinite. And now, like, what if I don't feel like
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Thought Hack podcast. Really quick, I'd love to give a shout out to Sunstroke. They just recently launched in the US, and you could check out a review for those guys over at calistechnews.com now. Of course, we also want to thank our other sponsors, Blue Microphone, Catalyst Case, and Wildhorn Outfitters. So I've been wanting to have a conversation because we sat down like a couple of weeks back and we had a really cool off mic conversation that could have been the podcast in itself.
Sure.
And you very humbly kind of dropped, they're very humble brags. It wasn't really bragging, but it was like stuff that you kind of flippantly just kind of, whatever. But it was really a big deal to me because I'm a huge hip hop nerd. But Bill Stephney, I'm saying that correctly, right? Mm-hmm. Is with us today. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for coming out and taking the time to hang out with me and let me kind of pick your brain a bit.
Thank you for the invitation.
And you've been very patient because we had technical difficulties, and then it was super patient, guys. Very Jedi-like.
Not a problem. Very professional here.
Thank you very much. So, Bill, before we go into everything, because there's a lot I want to talk to you about, your background. Currently, we met because you're working with Mochify, but you have a long storied history that starts, I would say, with that picture you showed me a couple weeks back, and Russell Simmons and Def Jam.
Yeah. I think I benefit from a number of factors of just being born in the early 1960s in the New York City area, when all sorts of things are happening. It's the dawn of the civil rights movement, mm-hmm. and being of African American descent and proud heritage, to be one of the first children that gained benefit from the fights of many years, but specifically those from the 50s and 60s. So being those kids, along with being in the New York area and having close proximity to TV stations and radio stations and networks.
Was it that easy
media.
back then?
To listen to WBLS in the New York area and watch great TV channels that we had. TV was very limited back then, in that we only had VHF channels of 2, 4, let's see if I remember, 5, 7, 11, and 13, and some UHF stations. So rather than being in a small marketplace where you may have had access to one small little TV station or even just radio, let's say you were in the Midwest or Southwest or even in the South, we were in the biggest media market still in the 1960s on the globe. So being in New York, civil rights movement, having parents who were incredibly dedicated to their responsibilities for raising children, and growing up in communities where that was also a tremendous value. I don't think I had enough room to fail. That folks actually provided all the tools necessary.
Because I don't really believe in luck, but I do feel like there's sometimes this kismet where there's just everything in tune with what you're doing is happening the way it is supposed to happen, or everything's happening optimally all at the same time.
Yeah, you have to. you can believe in luck, you can believe in divine intervention, but I've like to talk about this, that for those of us who were of the late 50s, early 60s, or just 60s, I would say, generations, and I include folks like Spike Lee, Chris Rock. You can point to Prince, Michael Jackson.
I would frame that picture you had in your phone, which is great. Like you have everybody in that picture.
Sure. But if you're born in that specific, I think late 50s, going to about 1970-ish air pocket, you think about it. No slavery, no Jim Crow, and no crack. So you have parents who are post-World War II who are accessing opportunities that black people previously, that black people previously were unable and were disconnected from accessing. And we wind up being the children of those parents who start to experience very real opportunity. And again, I make the argument it's also prior to some of the decline, I think, that we've seen over the course of the past several decades within our communities. So we always thought about possibility, rather than improbability or impossibility. And I think I may have mentioned this to you when we spoke before, that the prom song for my high school in 1980 was "Ain't No Stopping Us Now" by McFadden and Whitehead. And that's really, I think, the theme for those of us who came up during that era. Yes, we knew
very
there were
optimistic
problems from
era,
the beginning, but hey, nothing's going to get in our way. Another song from that time, from around 1982, "Keep On" by the group D Train. Just incredible optimism that there were successes from the challenges against racism and discrimination, and that gave us full engines and fuel to move society forward and to move our community forward. So we are ready to go.
So what happened to that optimism? Do you feel like, I'm going to speak about like African Americans at large, and we're going to kind of make the generalization before we focus on you specifically.
Sure.
But where did that optimism go?
That's a great question. I think it still exists to some degree, to some measure, and I think it's hard for me, at my advanced position in life now, to make a declaration whether or not it exists at the same level it did when I was 18, 19, 20, versus what happens today. I would, I'd have to ask my kids.
I'll say, okay, what I will say is there is an optimism now. Mm-hmm. There is a sort of optimism now, but look
at what you're doing.
Yeah.
Look at what's going on here.
But generationally, I feel like we're not going to break everyone down to millennials and everything, because I feel like labels are kind of weird.
Yeah.
But I feel like the optimism back then still came with a context, and there was a responsibility attached to it, where it's like we're coming off of the back of something that was pretty serious and so on and so forth, whereas some of the optimism now might be a little bit more entrenched in entitlement or something. It's a different vibe.
Yeah. If I had to hazard a guess in terms of differences, maybe the optimism tends to be more individualized today. So you'll find somebody who's accomplished and developed a project, a business, a work of art, And on an individual basis, we give them all their flowers for that. What you're doing here, and we're seeing more and more of that. I would say perhaps the slight difference may be environmental. That 30, 40 years ago, we still had parents who were essentially Orthodox Christians.
Yeah.
So the notion of putting one foot in front of the other via hope was really religiously based. So, and that was just part of the overall culture. I had friends that I grew up with who you didn't see every day because they were in church with their grandmother, with their parents, so forth. So even for those households who weren't as religious as those folks were, nonetheless, that effect of their behavior reverberated throughout the community. So, I had teachers who were in essence Bible study teachers, Orthodox Christians themselves. There were certain sectors on Long Island of folks who were in the nation too as well. So the religiosity of the community, number one, gave structure, gave a sense of hope and I think belief and a sense of guidance too, which fueled perhaps some of the optimism versus what may happen today, where I don't know if some of those undergirding factors exist as much.
And your optimism as an individual, has that sort of survived the time, the decades? I mean, because you mentioned the crack epidemic and all that other stuff. Do you maintain that optimism today?
Yeah, and I have to. I'm a dad.
Yeah.
So
you gotta hope for the best.
Yeah. Hey, whether it's Corona or
right
whatever, man, you think, all right, well, we'll get over this and we'll get to the next destination.
It's the alternative is
not good.
You don't want to think about that.
Yeah.
So besides the stuff with Def Jam, which I definitely want to get back to, and we don't have to talk about this if you don't want to. Your resume includes basically working with groups from different hip hop backgrounds, so on and so forth. Specifically, I guess we're gonna mention Public Enemy, and they've been in the news lately. What do you think it is about groups, before we focus on Public Enemy or whatever is going on? What do you think it is about bands once they get together or something like that it just, because I mean you know these guys personally, I can only guess, but that I guess has them breaking up over a certain amount of time? Is it because they're spending too much time together, or is this something that eventually is just doomed to not work out?
Well, yeah, bands are collectives and organizations and units, and they are subject to the variables and factors that break up companies, partnerships, families, marriages. We're human, even when we're in a cool group. So whether those factors are economic, emotional, spiritual, ideological, geographical, you get, and this is not necessarily even with PE, I think there's some element for them where this might be a factor, but there are great groups and bands where they do so well that one member lives in Ireland, one lives in the Bahamas, and one lives in California.
Yeah.
And, how do you navigate that? And
you don't think that'd be better? I feel like I'm close to certain members of my family because we spend so much time apart. So every time we get together, it's kind of we're still in that honeymoon space because we never moved out of that. We kind of get away every time we get back together. It's a good time because we don't have time to fight. We spend so much time apart. By the time we get together, we're just catching up. We're having a good time. We're doing whatever we got to do, and then we're going our separate ways again.
Yeah, I think it depends. Because you might have, one member, and I've seen this with with groups where, one member has saved well and done well and invested well and doesn't have to work, doesn't have to go on the road. You get to the age of over 40, going to your 50s, 60s, 70s, as we see with some of the groups today. And the road isn't as enticing as it was when you were a teenager or in your 20s and you made all this money and you're living on some estate or some farm. You don't want to leave there. Versus you might have a member who did not invest or had several divorces, may have child support issues, may have some tax issues. That member has to tour.
He depends on you.
And he completely depends on you to get out there and sing those hits that you had on the radio in 1982. Mm-hmm. So, there's a push-pull even within an organization where the objectives are not aligned.
The labels didn't have something in place back then, like some type of financial education thing, or it was like, hey guys, no.
Yeah, there's there's a tendency for us. Number one, when you're dealing with young people and young creative people who are in their late teens and early 20s, financial management, especially if they're coming from a point of disadvantage to, I have a hit record on the radio and now this club promoter is going to pay me $15,000 for this appearance. And I'm talking about late 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. You're just thinking about that money. You're not thinking about futures or investment or sustainability or anything. You're thinking about that cash money and how can I live
15
nice.
grand for appearance is still a lot now.
And that's what give you an idea. So if you had in 1984 a hit song just here in New York, nowhere else, getting played on, let me age myself, on the radio stations of that day, WBLS 107.5, 98.7 KISS FM, 92 KTU, 1600 WWRL. All these stations are playing your music, and you might even have a video out at that point playing on Video Music Box or New York City Hot Tracks on ABC. So your one hit now gives you the advantage of playing what was a robust club scene around 1984, 85, the Roxy in Manhattan on 18th Street, Club Encore in Jamaica, Queens, roller skating rinks also in Queens, playing the Fever in the Bronx, come out to Zanzibar here in Newark. You had about 20 to 40 potential clubs that you could play, paying you anywhere from $2,500 to $15,000 per hit. You could also wind up playing about 3 or 4 of those clubs within one night. You're just going from one performance to another. Where if you were Houdini or Curtis Blow or Grandmaster Flash and the Furious 5, you could see $25,000, $30,000 cash money from that weekend alone, just from that hit song. So the opportunity, just by virtue of folks having such passion for the music, the scene itself that had a club economy that we don't see around today, just gave fluid access to cash for people who were young and probably not prepared for it.
It's really unfortunate to think about because, usually when wealth comes into any community, you could hope to see advances or so on and so forth, some type of growth or investment locally. And I've just never really seen that with I think, and I might be off because I read these statistics a while ago, but African Americans, I think the dollar circulates only once in our community before it leaves out. And then there was something about 9 times out of 10, when we basically move out of a certain tax bracket, we don't really stay and invest in the community. We kind of just move out and try to find a place where I guess it makes more sense. I guess where the median, like, household income sort of kind of matches whatever we're making.
Sure.
Then, what could have happened differently seeing artists who were like so huge and like these icons, like, broke and like, trying to figure it out is heartbreaking. What could have been done differently?
I don't know. I don't know. You deal with the cards on the table. There are so many issues that we've dealt with as a people that serve as an overlay for all the decision making that we engage in, that it's hard to point to 1, 2, 3 factors that would have made things better. So, moving back 100 years, if the Tulsa race riots that burned down Black Wall Street don't happen, does that mean, and some of the others, Rosewood, and some of the other historical stories that we know of where black economies that existed after slavery, during Reconstruction, that created thriving communities were destroyed from the exterior, were destroyed by the KKK, by racism, white supremacy. If those circumstances don't happen, do we then have the historical confidence to keep on building so that when that money comes into the community in 1984, it's being invested into institutions within our community rather than, well, we don't have institutions within our community because if we build something, the white man's going to blow it down. Sort of the big bad wolf theory. Yeah.
So Tulsa would have become like some sort of proof of concept where they're like, okay, we can do this everywhere versus...
Rather than it's going to be taken away from us one day. Now, that didn't happen in every circumstance. There are great stories about places like Hayti, North Carolina, which was Durham, North Carolina, which was sort of like Tulsa and didn't get burned down. But over time, the choices of the community and of the culture to integrate, to determine that institutions outside of the community were more important to integrate into rather than developing the internal institutions, that decimated those communities. We even saw it to a certain extent where I grew up on Long Island, in communities like Hempstead, where there were institutions and businesses within the community that were black owned and black run, but as segregation declined nationally and also on a local basis, and the desire to integrate, not necessarily to desegregate, to integrate into institutions exterior to the community just decimated those institutions within the community, just leaving you literally with nothing. So I get a big piece of change if I'm that big entertainer or athlete in the 80s or early 90s. I'm doing what I've been told and what the culture's been doing for the decades since the Tulsa era, which is to invest that money, that cash, outside of the community rather than internally.
What separates the mentality of the guy who... I was watching a interview with it's like 90s Sir Mix-a-Lot, who's still like very well off and he's doing okay, to someone who maybe didn't invest their money or maybe didn't understand the business of music. What separates those guys in terms of their mindset?
It's random. That could have been Mix-a-Lot's parents, his family, a neighbor, or a teacher. That's individualistic versus collective, where everybody or a huge portion of those folks who made money from the culture, from entertainment, media, athletics, from that period. And I think things have gotten better today, but at least from the 70s, 80s, going to the early 90s, people weren't thinking immediately as artists to be fiscally responsible, to invest, to look at their earnings as something that would grow, based on their decision making beyond what they did on stage or on a mic or in a studio.
And responsibility probably didn't really even fit into what the culture was,
No,
right? You
no,
have
absolutely.
Living fast, die young kind of mentality.
Yeah. Get rich or die trying, somebody once said, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I think he's rich now. I think it worked out for him. I think it worked out for him.
But there it goes again, individual.
Yeah, true. So back to Public Enemy, and I don't know how in depth you want to go with this. It's funny because I just recently saw Flav in Vegas a couple of weeks ago, at CES. Public Enemy, to what I understand and what I know about the band, kind of started off with this whole movement for the people, very political. If I were to think about a political rap group, they're like the first that come to mind. Very political, very pro-African American, rebel kind of music, right?
Correct.
What do you think changed through the years to kind of have them end up where they are now, where it's just sort of like everybody's kind of in a place where this wasn't... It started off very idealistic, and now it's something else.
Time, age, economics, all of the variables that we all deal with. The culture changed too.
Yeah.
It was interesting because you're right. The intent when we put Public Enemy together was to specifically create a music group that was as political in orientation as, for instance, there was a punk group from England called The Clash, and they were incredibly political in the early 80s. So we wanted to develop a rap group that was sort of a mashup of Run DMC and The Clash. One that was popular like Run was, and for those years, there was nobody more popular than Run DMC. They were the Beatles of hip hop for us. And then to take the political energy of The Clash, talking about issues of class, of race, of economics, of just placement in general, of discrimination, to put it all together and see what would happen. That was sort of our college school experiment from Adelphi University to do Public Enemy. Now, for a group that was explicitly political, we did very, very well. Sold a lot of records. Public Enemy has toured the world who knows how many times over the course of the past 3+ decades. But the culture of hip hop, the music in general, radically changed from the point when the group debuted in the late 80s to where we sit today. I point to the changeover actually from Public Enemy, X-Clan, KRS-One, Poor Righteous Teachers, the Native Tongues movement, which included De La Soul, Latifah, and Tribe Called Quest. That's around 1989, 1990. That gets moved out really by the West Coast, by NWA going to all the death row stuff, and then there's sort of a boomerang effect where the East Coast had to match the energy of the West Coast, which is where Wu-Tang and Bad Boy now come in. So that paradigm shift that happened in the early 90s, really set the tone for how we remember those great years for Public Enemy from 1987 to about 1990. We don't remember them as strongly because there was just such a paradigm shift.
The change in the music, I feel like was again maybe and I could be wrong. It went from like, hey, we have to. There was still a sort of light optimism where it's like, fight the power. We're very optimistic. Things are going in the right path. To the music kind of went to a place where it's like, okay, like we've been trying to fight the power. We're a little bit more pissed off now. We're a little bit more impatient.
Well, Tupac.
Yeah.
Because by all rights, Tupac should have been Chuck D. He should have been Chuck D. Jr.
Yeah.
He literally comes from the Black Panthers. But I see him as an interesting bridge figure because rather than represent his political heritage and legacy, he decided to go in another direction, which is where that paradigm shift that I talked about just overall, moved everything to. So he winds up being death row.
I think he still touched on a lot of the same themes, even though musically it was very different and the language was different. But I think the spirit of a lot of it still kind of, they spoke about police brutality and racism and stuff going on. Sure.
Especially on his first album. I think Tupac represented what was, an internal struggle during those years of, young men trying to figure out, what is the direction here? Am I public enemy or, am I death row? Which way can I be both? Can I navigate that? And, that was a choice that those of us from the earlier generation didn't really have to make. And to a large measure, maybe that's why some of us are still around today, because we didn't go through those intense internal battles.
So, and it's crazy, just really quick, MC Hammer was on death row for a little bit, which is weird, right?
Yeah. He tried to get on Def Jam.
Yeah, he tried to.
Yeah, I met him in 1986. He, this is before he signed. I still have his business card.
From back then?
From back then. We met at the Black Radio Exclusive Music Conference in Los Angeles in 1986. And he knew I didn't drink, and he didn't drink either, so he just kept on buying me these cranberry juices, me and then trying to get together with my boss, Russell Simmons, at the same time. But, we were East Coast guys, could not hear, a dance, because, there were no videos, and we didn't know he was going to be a dancing MC. We could only hear his demos, and I think he was still trying to develop and craft his MC style, which then matched all the dancing and made him what he was.
It's crazy because I remember as a kid how popular he was, very young. I remember when 5 or 6 how popular he was, and now he's kind of this precautionary tale.
Yeah, and I don't know why, because he was tremendous, and you're right, but he was tremendously successful. So around the time when he was at his height, and since I was a writer as well, I started actually writing about music before I was working at Def Jam. And occasionally I still do write. And at that point, I was still doing some side pieces here and there. So a hip-hop publication asked me to travel out to interview Hammer to find out and really get to the bottom of why he was trash. And I came back to him. I said, well, I can't do that because there are people who like him, who just because he doesn't touch our sensibilities doesn't mean that he doesn't please folks who are into his music, and they have a right to enjoy his music, and he has a right to entertain them. So we had sort of an elitist point of view about what Hammer represented when at the end of the day he's selling 15 million copies of that album.
I think the cautionary tale was more so in line with like him basically going bankrupt and.
Well, that
like,
goes to what we were talking
Yeah.
about, though. That you get the money in, and
like
you're
30
young.
or 40 people on payroll or something ridiculous like that.
You're employing half of Oakland and your family, and even though none of that economically makes sense, when you have folks who haven't had these resources, which means that we don't have the skill sets to manage these resources, it all becomes crossing your fingers as to whether or not you're going to maintain them or whether or not they're going to go bye-bye, and you learn from that. And now I think the educational tale is that Hammer has become a tech investor.
Oh, yeah. He was one of the first guys. He's
Yeah.
actually who introduced me to Twitter.
Yeah. So he learned.
Yeah.
He learned.
He came back, but I mean, that story's not really told. Like, it's sort of like, Hammer went broke.
But and we all go through it. But the good thing is, and there's an old saying that the only bad experience is one that you don't learn from. So yeah, you lose all that money, but you figured out how to make the money at least one time, which means you might have the ability to make that money again, except manage it much better than you did the first time.
Hopefully.
You hope.
That second go around.
You absolutely hope.
So what took you from like hip hop to now consulting and working with
Mocafy and
finance?
Yeah, sure. What took me? I think it's all consistent. Being out here in Newark and working for a great young company like Mocafy, led by Wale Coxum, to me is completely aligned and similar to what I did when I started working for Rick Rubin and Russell Simmons for Def Jam in the mid '90s. Listen to me, in the mid '80s. That a young company with tremendous vision, community based, tapped into where the culture is going and where the society is going. In the mid '80s, it was the culture of hip hop, and in 2020, it's wealth management. It's us trying to figure out how do we navigate the tremendous racial wealth gap that has existed now for decades, if not centuries. How do we employ our education? How do we employ some of the resources that we have been able to access over the course of the past decades? How do we raise money? And how do we use all of these skills in order to build our communities?
Well, it's funny because I land a couple of places on the subject. I recently had a guest on, and we were talking about, I guess, wealth management and anything having to do with finances in our community, because I remember growing up, talking about money was very uncomfortable. It's sort of like a taboo. You don't talk about money.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's tacky. You don't compare, like, if you're working with someone, I have no idea what you're making, because it's tacky. Like, why would we talk about that? Like, that's something like, relatively private. And it was always this, how do we figure out how to integrate and diversity and so on and so forth. Whereas I've sort of drifted a bit and gotten to the point where I understand there's been like historical and systemic racism, and feel free to jump in at any point. I understand that there's been like historic and systemic racism, but yeah, we don't have a time machine. There's nothing we can do about that. We're here now. We got to figure it out, right?
Well, why are you building what you've already built, which is already quite considerable, especially given your youth?
Yeah.
What's pushed you to become entrepreneurial? Is it the culture? Was it family? Why?
learning.
I don't mean to interview you.
No,
I know this
no,
is
it's
your
fine.
show.
No, it's a conversation. No, we're having a conversation. I hate interview format stuff, but it's mostly from my standpoint. And my parents are immigrants. My parents are both Haitian, and I grew up with the mentality or this thing being drilled into me where it's like the world doesn't owe you anything.
Sure.
You know what I mean? You've got to figure it out, and their way of figuring it out was education. Like, you know, we came here to make sure you got your education, and I mean, I think at that point there was still like, you know, these residual waves from that whole American dream that kind of started to manifest in like the 50s.
Sure.
And people still believed in that, even though I felt like around the time when my parents got here, they got here in like the 90s, it already started to begin to get eroded, and we could get into that whole political thing. But nowadays, like, you know, we have the gig economy, and that's been a long time coming. That a bachelor's degree doesn't guarantee you anything. Education is like it's a tool, if anything else. A degree is a tool, if anything else, but it doesn't guarantee anything. And I knew if I was going to fail at something, I would rather bet on myself. So yeah, I kind of put my money where my mouth is and kind of figured it out. And, you know, if things go left, at least, you know, I tried kind of deal.
Sure.
And ownership was very important to me, and investing in my, you know,
And that's a key, though.
Yeah.
Because and you cited your parents' background to come to this country, which is a crucial factor of leaving one place where you feel uncomfortable and denied to go to some place where you perceive there will be increased opportunity, which is, you know, something for, and I know people use this term ADOS today, but for, you know, African Americans who have been here, you know, since the point of chattel slavery, beyond the great migration of going from the South, as my paternal grandparents and great grandparents did from the South coming to New York, you know, there wasn't that other place of opportunity. There was just no opportunity. So when you think about ownership, you know, to me, that sounds like a residue of the choices of your parents looking for opportunity. For hundreds of years, for African Americans, those of Southern heritage coming from slave trade, Jim Crow South, there wasn't that rainbow of opportunity consideration. So you don't think ownership. You think the closest thing you can get to is, well, maybe I'm going to get a job somewhere working for somebody who owns something, or as a side to that, the government.
So there were no reference points at that point in terms of I see him doing it, so I could maybe do it myself.
Individual rather than environmental.
Gotcha.
You know, so yeah, there was Oscar Micheaux, you know, the filmmaker. There was Madam C.J. Walker. Fast forward several decades, and you get somebody, and we talked about him earlier, Percy Sutton, who was Malcolm X's lawyer, who built Inner City Broadcasting and WBLS and its Showtime at the Apollo and owned the Apollo Theater here in New York. You had these individuals, but, you know, for my childhood and you know, educationally, growing up in Hempstead, Long Island, we weren't taught about entrepreneurs. We were taught get good grades, go to college, and you'll get a job somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, mostly the same thing to me, but I mean, I think you can only pass down what you're aware of, and entrepreneurship wasn't a thing. I think the question that kept nagging me as a kid was like, you know, because my parents would always say, hey, you grow up and you like, you know, you go to school so you could get a job. And it always seemed like this like endless cycle. Like, so I get a job for what? So I can work, so my kids can go to school, so they could get a job, so they can work, and like, it just seems like lemmings running off of a cliff. And then I asked them, but what about the guy who owns the job? Like what about the guy that owns the building? Like, what did he do?
Yeah.
And then they were like, yeah, we're not really, I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I was just like, okay, I got to find out.
Sure. And same thing here. My father was one of the first of the black people in corporate America generation. So, he went to college. He went to City College in New York, then went into the military, went into the Army, was stationed in Germany when he was like in his early 20s, like around 2021, then came back to work at Time Incorporated. And Time Incorporated in 1954, as he came back, launched a new magazine called Sports Illustrated. And he worked in the mailroom as a 20-something and worked his way up to being an editor in the photography department, I think an associate editor. So, and interestingly enough, because he was really the sole African American to work his way through the ranks to a level of executive, he also became the Sports Illustrated representative to many of the black athletic stars of that era. So he's the black man that they're sending when there's a big Muhammad Ali fight against Sonny Liston.
That's really cool.
Oh, it was wonderful to see. He winds up being on the scene for photo shoots for O.J. Simpson and for Larry Holmes and for Reggie Jackson and all these folks. So, but he didn't rise above the position of associate photo editor. It's not like he became the photo editor or even the editor of the magazine. He was incredibly limited in that regard, being one of the first generations of black folks in corporate America, and it really impacted him in negatively in many ways, and I got to watch that impact to say, well, shouldn't I be developing my own version of Sports Illustrated, like my own institution, rather than relying on somebody rising me up the ranks?
That's a little bit more complicated too, because I feel like that's something lost in a more recent generation, like the understanding of like historical context and understanding you kind of stand on the shoulders of giants. Like the barrier of entry now is a lot lower than it was back then. A kid could go out and start a magazine now. The internet is like this great equalizer, whereas back then...
What we're doing right now, for instance. Yes. So, I get the benefit of sitting with Reggie to talk this way. Unless I was important enough to be interviewed on WBLS or CBS News or ABC News or PBS, I wouldn't be in this situation with lights and microphones, so forth. That's what huge institutions did. But now, because of technology, you can essentially replicate what a multi-million-dollar television network struggled to do as recently as 2 decades ago. You're doing it right here in Newark.
Yeah. And the beautiful thing too is it's funny because I talk to a lot of small business owners, and while you're figuring it out, there's no roadmap as an entrepreneur. You're kind of like, you kind of could take a look at what other people are doing and kind of get an idea or the lay of the land, but yeah, for the most part, you're kind of figuring it out. The one benefit I would say to being a smaller company or a smaller business is mobility and speed. And it's crazy to watch small businesses try to mimic or copy the bureaucracy of a larger company. It's like you're kind of giving up the only advantage you have. Like, this is ridiculous. But again, a lot of people don't know any better. So if you're starting for instance, a media company or IT company or whatever, you're mimicking the brands that you've seen for years. But these guys employ like tens of thousands of people. It's just you and maybe 3 guys. Why do all 3 of you have to sign off on something? Like, why would you sign up for all? And I think the lack of education, the lack of know-how, and so on and so forth becomes another barrier. But again, even that we're figuring out. Like, you have a lot of information being put out. It's a lot easier to access, how to, and so on and so forth. So hopefully it changes things. I don't know.
Well, yeah, no, I think you're right. you know, so we think of businesses, or we historically have thought of business as, something big and institutional, with many bureaucracies and layers, so forth. But technology has essentially democratized that process, where we can replicate what would have taken a company 100 people to achieve, may now take just you, by virtue of these supercomputers that we walk around in our pockets. That's the theory behind Mocafy, that you can develop a bank that can address the issues of us not having access to the financial world, that you can do that using technology.
Yeah, shout out to those guys, man.
Yeah, and 10, 20 years ago, we would have thought, well, how can we build more banks within our community? It's just
I don't even carry cash anymore.
No.
I don't even pull out my card, because 9 times out of 10, I'm just kind of using my phone.
That's what you have that thing for.
Yeah.
So whether it's that, or even for music. So I salute the companies and the artists in 2020 who are able to replicate what we did with LL Cool J and the Beastie Boys and Public Enemy and Slick Rick and Run DMC, 35, 40 years ago. Because now you have...
Now, all those guys withstood the test of time.
Yeah, they have, and have made the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And, it's all wonderful and love. That's great. But, just getting to the studio to record a song, just for Run DMC to record It's Like That in the Sucker MCs in 1983, to raise the money to get it from a record company, as Russell Simmons had to get for his brother in 1983 from Profile Records, from Steve Plotnicki and Corey Robbins, to get whatever it was, $5,000. Go to a studio, master the song, and then get it pressed into and put it into stores, all of that. You can just do that now in about 3 hours, using your phone.
It's true.
That entire process has been reduced. What would have been a 3-month process of $5,000 to $10,000 of investment now can be done and put up on SoundCloud just by virtue of an instinct.
Now, here's the downside to that. It's great that everybody has a voice now, but now everybody has a voice.
That's right.
So now it's a lot of noise and nonsense coming out also.
That's right.
Whereas when Russell went out and he got it done, he was driven, I really need to get this done, versus someone who has a mobile device and they're like, oh, let me just kind of see where this goes. And you don't really have the mindset to sort of follow through with what this is. You're just kind of you have a lot of people who are in search of a dream, right? And that might not necessarily have been a great thing. The lowering of the barrier of entry at this point just kind of opens up this floodgate where now everybody's like, well, this might be the easiest thing for me to do. I might not be necessarily passionate about it, but everybody when you, for instance, if we were to think back to television, and when you had TV shows that were this was an event, everybody ran home so they could catch this show, and it wasn't on demand. If you missed it, you missed it. So you're sitting down with your whole family. You can have a hit show then, because it's not a lot of TV shows.
That's right.
Whereas now, I have too much to watch.
That's correct.
I'm literally going through Netflix and Disney Plus, and it's just so much content. Yeah. I can't get to all of it.
That's right.
So that sort of becomes another barrier in of itself.
I completely agree with you. And, I don't want to sound like, the old man, get off my lawn. But
Yeah.
I think it has made developing what we used to perceive as that central star incredibly difficult because, to your point, the marketplace is saturated because of the making easier.
Yeah, I hit that wall too.
Yeah, now I'm happy.
Yeah.
Making the process so much easier. So that 3-month process of getting the investment money, getting signed to a record company, getting the record pressed, then getting into stores, then getting it onto a radio station, then getting people to get to the record store to buy it. That was a natural filtering process. Not everybody could do that. Not everybody could do that. That's all gone. It's now anybody putting something on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud. So there, in essence, isn't any filtering process. So even if you are that great artist, you're going to be battling.
You have to work harder. Yeah.
You are going to be battling. And I see these online discussions. For Normani having issues, and Megan Thee Stallion having issues trying to get her stuff out, and Daniel Caesar and all. It's more difficult than ever because of what you referenced.
I think they have some contract stuff, and I think that's like education as far as the whole Megan thing. But excuse the language, but when it's harder to kind of figure out who's full of shit,
It is.
Here's a great story, Ice Cube, and I try to ingest and digest and all that as much content as possible. And Ice Cube was telling a story about John Singleton and Boys in the Hood. And he said when John Singleton first approached him, I don't know if you heard the story. John Singleton was actually an intern at the Arsenio Hall show. Mm-hmm. So when John Singleton first walked up to him and said, "Hey, I have this screenplay and there's this role that you'd be perfect for," Ice Cube was like, "What? Like, what are you talking about?" He stood and talked to him because he really wanted to get his group on to the Arsenio Hall show. So he was kind of putting up with John because John was helping him find Arsenio. Mm-hmm. And John's like, "Hey, I'm a freshman at UNC, and I want you to be in this movie." And Ice Cube's like, "Yeah, come on, man, whatever." Fast forward, I think he's doing some type of release or something's going on. He bumps into him again, bumps into John Singleton. John Singleton's like, "Hey, I'm a junior now. I still have the script. Mm-hmm. I would love for you to be in it." And Ice Cube still kind of like brushing him off. Fast forward a couple of years, his manager calls him and says, "Hey, they're doing this movie. They kind of want you to come in and read for it." He said, "Of course." He gets the script, so on and so forth, goes in, reads for it. Who does he see sitting there? John Singleton. Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Listen, man, I told you I had this role for you." And I mean, I'm thinking about John Singleton in that moment and how satisfying that must have been to be like, "Dude, I was completely serious." Like, sure. the look on Ice Cube's face. And of course, the rest is history. But that says to me that he had this incredible drive, and there was a fortitude where he was like, he wouldn't be denied this thing.
Yeah.
And now anybody with a camera phone could kind of just shoot something, which is cool because you have talented people who otherwise might have not been found, but at the same time, the noise.
Yeah.
And the nonsense.
Yeah. No. Resistance builds muscle.
Yeah.
Right? So you make the process easier, then you're not building as much muscle in order to get done what you need to get done. Yeah, I had two things. I had a similar experience with Spike Lee. Mm-hmm. So it's 1986. Spike Lee comes in after one of his first films, She's Gotta Have It. Actually, it hadn't come out yet. It was about to come out. And he has a meeting with Def Jam to talk about producing and directing music videos for the label. So I'm sitting at my desk. We're at 40 East 19th Street in this big dance studio that served as our office at that point. He's just waiting to have a meeting, and they just kept him waiting forever. They didn't know who he was. No one really knew. Mm-hmm. He was kind of just right out of NYU. Mm-hmm. And She's Gotta Have It had not come out yet. Now, I had a friend, the wonderful writer and producer Nelson George, who is an investor in She's Gotta Have It, who had told me about Spike already and about the movie about to come out. So, I was the only one in the office who was aware of who he actually was. And I told him, hey, here I am, Bill Stephney. I work for Def Jam. I do promotions, which is what I did at that point. I can't wait to see your new film. And he said, wow, you know about it? I said, yeah, She's Gotta Have It. I can't wait. So he has the meeting with Def Jam, with the leadership of the company. Nothing really happens from it, but we stay in touch. And within a month or two, I let him know, well, I'm working on this project that I'm producing with my college classmate from Adelphi, Chuck E. D. We're calling the group Public Enemy, and it's politically oriented. He said, really, will you send me stuff when you guys are done? So I started to send him stuff. And we even printed up some sweatshirts with the Public Enemy logo that Chuck designed and sent it to him. And when he directed and produced School Days, you'll see a scene with Branford Marsalis, who's in the movie. He's wearing the sweatshirt that we sent to him. So that relationship continued, just by virtue of two people who loved the music, loved the culture, loved creativity, and wanted to push things further. So when he came to me, rode on his bicycle from his apartment to my apartment in Brooklyn, we lived about 5-6 blocks away from one another. He says, I have this script I want you to check out. It's about the hottest day in Brooklyn, and all sorts of stuff is going to jump off. Check it out, check it out, check it out. I said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? I want Public Enemy to make a song that will drive everything in the movie. Check it out, check it out, check it out. And that winds up being Fight the Power for Do the Right Thing. So, whether it's Ice Cube and John Singleton, Public Enemy.
You being involved in that process is like, and you say it like super casually, but that's crazy.
Because that was the era. Mm-hmm. And now to Ice Cube. So Ice Cube beefs with NWA and leaves the group. Yeah. Over all sorts of issues. Says he wants to create his solo album, signing directly to Priority Records. He's going to do his own solo album, but because he's beefing with NWA, he can't work with Dr. Dre and Yellow. So his second favorite production team was Public Enemy's production team, us, the Bomb Squad. Mm-hmm. So he comes to New York and he meets with us. And even though I had removed myself from everyday production from the Bomb Squad because I was now running Def Jam, nonetheless, we're meeting with him. So many of the strategy, well, I won't say many, but a couple of the strategy meetings around Ice Cube's first album, America's Most Wanted, actually happened in my living room in Brooklyn.
That's crazy.
Just because everybody was around.
And it was probably like a smaller world, whereas now entertainment's it's like a jillion people.
Yeah.
So what do you feel in you kind of lent to this longevity, whereas like so many people are falling out of the industry, or they things didn't work out as well for them? You seem pretty well adjusted, you're happy, family man, still have that optimism we talked about. What helped you maintain that through the years?
Oh man, that's a good question. I love music, just as long as it's grooving. That's what they said on the record. well before you were born. And I was a musician too. I played guitar, drums, trumpet, keyboards. I was in bands when there were still bands. I'm from that era. The feeling that you get when there's a great beat, great melody, great rhyme, great vocalist, hearing Luther sing live, all that stuff. I mean, that's like a cosmic spiritual energy. That keeps you going. And then the other stuff that we've already talked about of being nurtured by great parents in a great community. And now, to your point, being a family man, to having a wonderful wife, having incredible kids. All of these things are fuel that keep you going. And maybe it's my own fairly traditional, boring, nerdish life. But, it's sort of the tortoise and the hare, the slow turtle that continues forward and
so
runs the race and
you
wins.
never subscribe to that live fast, die young situation.
No. As I tell everybody, there.
You mentioned you weren't drinking stuff.
Unlike NWA, there are no videos of Bill Stephney wet and wild parties in Brooklyn from 1989. I mean, I wasn't an angel, but in terms of that crazy excess sort of life, it just never really appealed to me.
I mean, not to beat a dead horse, but that whole Flav getting kicked out of Public Enemy thing. Like, I mean, what was your reaction to that?
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Public Enemy has gone through all sorts of different configurations. Different lineups. Folks have retired, come back in, gone back out, so forth. But we all grow, and a lot of times we're not the same person that we were 35 years ago. Because I'm boring, I'm probably a little closer, but I'm not the same guy I was when I lived down the street from Biggie, when I was 27, 28 years old, and he was just a teenager, and I'm running away from the Junior Mafia standing on the corner of Fulton in Washington.
That's nuts.
Because they're yelling at me, "Yo, Mr. Def Jam." I have my Def Jam jacket on. "Yo, Mr. Def Jam, Mr. Def Jam." I said, well, they're crack dealers. I don't think I should be hanging out here. Let me get out of here. But as it turned out, that's Biggie and Lil C's and all those guys. I would have destroyed their career because I would have lectured them on on their lyrics.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have heard Warning if they had been signed to my company.
It's one of my favorite songs. It's one of my favorite songs.
Why do y'all need to do this in order for our community to uplift and stuff? I would have been that guy.
I mean, hip hop's created like ridiculous wealth, and it's one of those. I feel like when you're looking at African Americans, to be such a small demographic globally, for us to impact culture on the world stage in such a big way is insane.
It's amazing.
And then to turn around and then look at the numbers and kind of realize we own very little of it is kind of unfortunate too.
Yeah, and I think the two are tied because we were so denied structurally and institutionally. We focused so much of that energy creatively. Much of that driven by the black church for 100+ years. Not as much today, though, by the way. And maybe as we're figuring out things more these days from a business standpoint, maybe you're not going to see that fixation on innovation and creativity as you saw before. So, it's all a delicate balance, I think.
All right, so I'm not going to monopolize your time too much.
It's fine, having a good time.
Yeah. But in nearing the end and closing, I wanted to get your thoughts on something that I've always been a big proponent of, which is ownership. to the young entrepreneur who's figuring things out and debating about whether or not to sell their IP or whatever. Don't get me wrong. Like, if somebody pulls up and offers me a check,
You gotta take that check.
Yeah, I'm taking that check. I believe very, very firmly, if I can build something, like if I sell you this bottle, I haven't sold you my ability to make this bottle. I've just sold you the bottle.
If you knew what you were doing, you can do it again.
Yeah, pretty much.
The key to science is replication.
That, and like, I used to always think, yeah, I'm never going to retire, so on and so forth. But I'm kind of tired now, man. I could take a couple of months off. How important is ownership to you, and just in general?
In this society as it's structured,
Yeah,
it's everything. Because it's control. And
that's the word, right?
Yeah, Janet Jackson. And if you don't have the control, someone else will have that control. So,
and hence the leverage.
Without question, and with that control comes freedom. My ability, the ability for you and I to get together today and have this conversation is probably in the middle of the afternoon is based on the fact that we're both entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Versus if I had my 9 to 5 and you had your 9 to 5, we would be beholden to the dictates of our bosses.
I still might
jobs.
be here. I was a horrible employee. I was the worst. I was the worst employee.
Aside,
I always felt like I was smarter than the guys I worked for.
And that's good to know.
Yeah.
And I've had friends who have worked for individuals where I've had to pull them to the side and explain to them the reason why you're so frustrated is because you're smarter than your boss.
Yeah.
So shouldn't that compel you to figure out how to leverage your intellect and your abilities to become your own boss, like the guy you're mad at?
Yeah, but that's scary because I would liken being an entrepreneur to somebody who jumps out of the window while figuring out how to build the parachute. Like you don't know how you're going to land. You don't know if you're going to have the parachute in time to land. So, it's a scary thing.
It is a scary thing, but we're starting to figure it out. Should the economy not completely tank due to the coronavirus?
I feel like I'd still figure it out. I think I'd still.
Well, that's good.
Happen.
The confidence is, man. That
there's
is
always a silver lining.
Yeah, it's optimism.
Yeah.
Again, ain't no stopping us now. Yeah. Keep on. Keep rising to the top.
I would replace the us with me.
Sounds of blackness. Optimistic.
The community, I don't know, but I'll figure it out.
Yeah, you will. You have already. Yeah. That's why we're here.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again for sitting down with me. You gotta frame that picture on your phone. Like if you don't have a frame copy,
I sent it to you, right? Didn't I send that picture to you?
Yeah. You gotta frame that cool. picture and put it somewhere, man. That's epic. It's cool. Like he had a picture. It was like Chris Rock. It was Russell Simmons, Rev Run, Spike Lee. I'm like, that's crazy.
Can't we show it? This is video, right?
I'm gonna put the picture up on the video. I'm gonna put the picture up.
Put the picture up.
Thanks so much for coming out, Bill. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Reggie.
Yeah,
anytime.
That's a new Corona shake.
It is.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Welcome to Thought Hack.